Hello and welcome. It is Erick Erickson here, the Erick Erickson Show. From the North Georgia mountains to the Florida line, from the Chattahoochee to the Atlantic Ocean, all across the state of Georgia. Now WMAC in Middle Georgia, covering all of Middle Georgia. Welcome aboard. We have to get into impeachment and Mitch McConnell's changed strategy and the Inspector General report, which is pretty damning to the FBI, and to James Comey, who's trying to say everything's hunky-dory. Before I get to the IG report, I want to finish up some stuff I was talking about in the first hour on impeachment. Mitch McConnell has decided he wants to change the Republican strategy. The Republican strategy, and perhaps, and there are some suggestions that the initial talking points from the GOP that they were going to drag this out for 8 weeks and screw up the Democratic presidential primary process, that was bluster, and that was trying to get the Democrats off the ledge on impeachment. And since they have not been able to do that, they're going to go forward with a minimal trial. They don't want to have all the witnesses there now. According to McConnell in a closed-door meeting that has, of course, leaked, McConnell wants to push for a full acquittal, not just dismissal. And he also wants to minimize a trial. And the reason McConnell wants to minimize a trial is because he doesn't want a bunch of witnesses coming in where nobody knows what they're going to say. It is too much instability, too much unpredictability, and he is deeply concerned about something like that happening. I think he's probably right about that. This is reporter Manu Raju from CNN. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is expected to hold a final vote to acquit President Donald Trump should he be impeached when a majority of senators believe his trial has run its course, instead of holding a vote on dismissing the articles of impeachment, 2 Republican senators told CNN. Republicans want to have a vote on acquittal, not simply rely on a 51-vote threshold procedural motion to dismiss the hotly disputed case. The Constitution mandates 67 votes are required to convict the president or remove him from office, a barrier widely considered too high to be reached in this case. McConnell can't rely on the vote of the vice president, who has no role in impeachment, even though he is the president of the Senate. Pence's power only applies to legislation and nominations. Instead, Chief Justice John Roberts will preside, and any tie motions would fail. One of the senators who spoke anonymously said McConnell would not call a vote on a motion to proceed to the impeachment articles unless he knew he had the 51 votes needed to end the trial, which would then set up a final vote on the articles themselves. On that final vote, 67 votes would be needed to convict Trump. The other senator, John Cornyn of Texas, said it would make more sense to move to vote on the articles of impeachment than on a motion to dismiss, and decide this on a 51-vote threshold with the potential tie and all the recriminations that would follow. McConnell hinted at this strategy when he spoke to reporters on Tuesday and said the Senate would have 2 choices after hearing opening arguments from the House impeachment managers and the President's Defense Counsel. It could go down the path of calling witnesses and basically having another trial, or it could decide, and again, 51 members could make the decision that they've heard enough and believe they know what would happen and could move to vote on the 2 articles of impeachment. Those are the options. No decision's been made yet. You need to understand this from McConnell's perspective. McConnell doesn't like uncertainty. He likes to go forward with foregone conclusions, and he likes to have everything on the table. At least he likes to know what's happening. You bring in John Bolton, and you start having witnesses testify. You don't know where this thing's going to go. You don't know where this thing's going to go. You bring in Mick Mulvaney, you put him under oath. You bring in John Bolton, you put him under oath. You bring in some of these other witnesses the Democrats have already talked to. The ones you already talked to, you know what they're going to say because you have their depositions. You have their closed-door testimony, and you have their public testimony. You give the Democrat prosecutors a chance to question them. You give the president's team the opportunity to rebut them. But let's say they do call John Bolton to testify. If they do call John Bolton to testify, Bolton has signaled he had concerns. So what does he say? And does that persuade Republican senators to move towards impeachment? McConnell doesn't know, and no one in the Senate knows what John Bolton would say. John Bolton's not sane. So why do you go down that road? You know, when you're in law school, and I went to law school, I was there, I graduated, and practiced law for really 5 years. I've got my bar license. I keep it inactive, but was actively a lawyer for 6 years. Took me a year to wind down some cases, but was otherwise practiced for law clerk for 2, practiced for 5, wound down my practice for a 6th year. One of the things they teach you when you're doing trials and whatnot is you don't put people on the stand and ask questions if you don't already know the answer. In the entire process, and this is one frustration for Republicans, is that the Democrats intentionally rush this process. And we need to get into this one angle that I mentioned in the last hour I haven't gotten to yet of how you can tell they rushed it and turned it into a partisan affair. There is a key thing that needs to be highlighted here. But you're taught in law school, and when you practice law with older lawyers, what you do is you go through a discovery process where you learn everything you need to know about the case, and you learn how to form a narrative. And you learn how to, when you think you're right, but you have information that undermines your case, how do you weave that information into the narrative? Because you know the other side's going to bring it up. So how do you bring it up in such a way that it undermines the narrative of the other side? And you never, ever, ever, never, ever put someone on the stand who you're going to ask a question to and you don't know the answer. You just don't do that. It winds up going badly for you. You know, I've mentioned the story before. I did an election trial. The election trials are the one place where you have to put people on the stand and you don't really know what they're going to say. I did a defense of an election in Taylor County, Georgia, years ago. It was in 2000. The clerk of court lost, I think it was 13 votes, and he sued to overturn the election. There's a mathematical formula that his lawyer didn't know about, and that they were not able to get the election overturned, even though he lost by only 13 votes. One of the people they put on the stand said he was intimidated. And so the lawyer gets him on the stand to talk about it being intimidated. He confirms he was intimidated. The judge loses his business, throws everybody out of the courtroom except the lawyers and this guy, and demands to know who intimidated the guy. And the guy looks at the judge and says, nobody intimidated me. The judge says, you just said you were intimidated. He says, yeah, I've never been to court before. True story, actually. True story. If you want to look it up, because you don't believe me, the year was 2000. It was the election of 2000. It was whoever the clerk of court was. I can't remember the guy's name now. Versus Taylor County Board of Elections, the Secretary of State. The guy believed that said he had been intimidated. This other woman comes up. Her brother had not signed his voter ballot, his absentee ballot. She had signed it. And the lawyer was demanding that it be thrown out, and she explained that her brother had signed his voter registration card back in the 50s or 60s. He was old. He had died between the election and the trial. And like the day after the election, the guy died. He was ancient, and both of his arms had been torn off in a cotton gin, and that's why she had to sign his absentee ballot for him. I'm not making that one up either. It was like a scene out of My Cousin Vinny. And generally, though, the rule is you put people on the stand and you already know what they're going to say. And that's the same thing with impeachment. And when you don't, there are too many variables, and McConnell doesn't want to do that. So if he can hear the opening statements of both sides and then move to acquit the president based on what's presented, that's what he wants to do. Now, the Democrats, of course, know this, and they're going to make the best opening statement they can. But then the president's lawyers know it as well, and they're going to make their best opening statement. So we'll see where it goes. But it's an interesting, now that this is a reality and there's no bluster on either side, seeing the Republicans now say, maybe we're not going to drag this out, is an interesting shift. Now, I do want to point out, before we get into the Inspector General, I got a lot of audio on the Inspector General. We're going to spend some time on this because it's deeply troubling. But here's the reality of what the Democrats are doing. And I spent part of last hour, reading Chip Roy's statement. Chip Roy is a congressman from Texas. He is a dear friend of mine, really good friend of mine. And he's decided he'll listen to the remaining evidence, but thus far it looks like this is a matter for the voters, not for Congress and impeachment. There are 24 Republicans leaving Congress. There are 24 Republicans leaving Congress. Half of them, at least, dislike the president. Democrats have been saying for 3 years now, why are Republicans defending the president? Well, they're scared of the base. They're scared of the base. They're scared of the president. They're scared of the base. These are Republican members of Congress who definitionally are no longer scared of the base because they will never be voted on by the public again. And if they vote against the president, if they decide to vote for impeachment, they will be heralded as heroes by the media. They will be vetted by Hollywood. They will be given book deals. They will get TV contracts. If they were to say no to the president, these Republicans will be heralded as heroes. Statues will be built for them. Parties will be thrown in their honor. Alyssa Milano will say nice things about them on Twitter for standing up to the president and those icky, awful, racist Republicans. When Barack Obama wanted to get Obamacare through the House and the Senate, he relied on outgoing, retiring Democrats to make it happen. He didn't have the votes. With the Democrats who were going to run for re-election again, he didn't have the votes. Barack Obama relied on retiring Democrats to give him the votes to pass Obamacare. The Democrats should be able to persuade some of these Republicans who don't like the president. They blame the president for the state of the party. They think the president's going to long-term hurt the party and hurt the country. They blame the president for them having to retire. They blame the president for the Republicans losing control of Congress. They blame the president's voters for being an a cult of personality, and they never have to deal with these people again. You would think that these people would be persuadable by the Democrats. You would think the Democrats could persuade them, and they can't, and they haven't even tried. If the Democrats can't get these 24 or so Republicans to go along with impeachment, why should the public? These are the most persuadable Republicans, and some of them really dislike the president and privately will tell you how much they dislike the president. And yet, they're not going with impeachment. Well, we've heard forever that they're not standing up to the president because they're scared of the president's base and the voters. They no longer have to face the voters. They're never going to be on a ballot again. Which suggests that what you're hearing in the media and the circle of the wagons and the people who always have hated the president and they're just more vocal now, that they're missing something on impeachment, that the spin you're getting from the media is skewed towards the Democrats. I got a lot of friends of mine who really hate the president, and they've always hated the president, and the only thing that's changed now is they're more vocal about hating the president and wanting him gone, and they will absolutely justify impeachment. And these are the people who should be asking themselves, why can't the Democrats get a guy like Will Hurd from South Texas, who was in the intelligence community himself, to go along with this? Why can't they get any of these Republicans to go along with them? Maybe the Democrats should be asking themselves why they can't. And perhaps had they had that discussion to begin with, they would have gone about impeachment in a different, more persuasive way. But right now, more than half the registered voters in this country, according to Quinnipiac, and these Republicans in Congress all say let the voters decide, don't do impeachment. The Democrats will have more Democrats vote against impeachment than have Republicans vote for it. That should concern them, and it clearly doesn't.
Erick Erickson gives you the information you need and the truth you demand.
Rashida Tlaib, member of Congress, put out a tweet just a short time ago condemning the violence in Jersey City that led to a number of Jewish residents being killed. She said white supremacy continues to kill. The shooting was done by black people. Thankfully, she has deleted it. Yeah. We'll get there. We do need to talk about the anti-Semitism. But first, Doug Collins has been speaking, and I want to play some of Doug Collins in the House. I got to tell you, several people have told me they have seen Doug Collins in the last week, and he has looked worn out. And I have to agree, he does look a little worn out. And keep him in his family in your prayers. He's been under the weather, but I'm sure this has got to be just a grading exercise.
Don't give me the solemnity about impeaching a president. You've been wanting to do that for a long time. You ought to take it and just rejoice. Go at it, because this is what you wanted. But when it comes to the hearing, when it comes to the minority rights, when it comes to one that in which we have seen time after time after time, in which I have had to write this chairman multi-page letters on the abuse of procedural issues in this committee, this is a travesty. Write about it if you want, talk about it if you want, but the American people see it, because the American people understand inherently fairness. They understand due process. Why? Because it's what America was based on. It is what America takes pride in. And when we don't have it, nobody can have it. When we don't have fairness in this committee, how can they stand up and say, on the two weakest articles of impeachment in the history of this country, honestly, with a straight face, look at the American people and say, we did good? No, you didn't. You stained this body. You've taken this committee and made it a rubber stamp.
That's Doug Collins talking about impeachment, and he's not wrong. Listen, every impeachment process begun in the Judiciary Committee in the past, including Clinton's, Nixon's, and even going back to Andrew Johnson, both sides were allowed to call witnesses that they wanted and have those witnesses vetted. The White House, the president's lawyer was able to participate. The Democrats didn't do it this time. They did deviate from what has historically been done in the past, and I do think that matters. Now, there's something else that matters. This is specifically related to Georgia. If you're listening online somewhere other than Georgia, it actually applies to you as well, but Georgia is one of the entities that is deeply in the news on this, and it has to do with the census. And there are a number of counties in Georgia where a significant proportion of people are expected to not respond to the census. Now, shouldn't have to explain this, but I guess I do. The House of Representatives is divided into districts. Those districts are based on population. Each state gets a district for every, I think it's 750,000 people, 725, 750,000 people or so. Each state gets a district. Same with your state house and your state senate. Those are divided so that the populations of each district are equal. The more people you have, the House of Representatives has a fixed number of seats, and the more people Georgia gets, the more likely it is, say New York has lost population and Georgia has gained population, New York can lose a congressional district and Georgia can gain a congressional district. But the way to figure this out is a census. Also, your state gets federal dollars in proportion to its citizens. The more citizens your state has, the more money it gets from the federal government in block grants and other things for education, for poverty, for housing, for roads, you name it. And In Georgia, the census count will begin in January. Census workers are being hired right now. They do door-to-door censuses in this country. The Democrats wanted to do statistical sampling, and the Supreme Court said statistical sampling isn't valid. The Constitution requires an actual door-to-door census, knock on doors and take the census. And what typically happens is you'll get something in the mail from the federal government. You will fill it out and you will send it in. If you don't, people will come to your door and say, hey, we need to know how many people live in your house. There are a number of counties in Georgia that are expected to be completely ignored by the census or to not have adequate responses. I have the names of those counties.
15.
And I want us to go through them because some of them are in the listening area, including Clark County. I'll tell you what I know when we come back here on the Erick Erickson Show. I want to spend a good bit of time on the Inspector General's report. Mr. Horowitz testified yesterday. Before I do, though, this program is really specifically in Georgia. And while I have a master plan for worldwide domination, right now we are in Georgia, and I want to spend a little bit of time on a story in Axios, that there are a number of groups in the state of Georgia that are expected to be undercounted in the census. And the census affects everything about our relationship with the federal government. The census determines the number of representatives we have in Congress. It determines the amount of money we get for highway funds. It determines the amount of money we get for public schools, for housing, for campaigns to fight poverty. It determines a lot. And there are a number of counties in Georgia that the federal government is predicting will get undercounted. And the undercounting tends to be unauthorized immigrant populations, large minority populations, non-traditional households, lots of young children, poverty, and lack of internet access. What typically happens is you're going to get a letter in the mail from the federal government that demands that you comply by responding to tell them how many people are in your house. And whether you're black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Native Hawaiian, you name it. And you are obligated legally to fill this out and send it back. And if you don't, you will get a knock at your door. Some people will get a very burdensome survey from the census, and that very burdensome survey will demand to know how many toilets you have in your house and all that. It's ridiculous. But the key here is the federal government wants to know about you and your household, how many people are in your household. And there are a number of counties in Georgia where the federal government is signaling that they may have a very, very difficult time getting people to respond. And I want to review some of that for you. One of them is our flagship station, WGAU in Athens, Georgia, and Clark County. The federal government is warning that up to 26.4% of the county could fail to respond. The reason being is there are a high proportion of renters because they're college students there. There's a low median income in Clark County. There's a high proportion living below the poverty line. And those factors, high renter, low median income, and high proportion below the poverty line, is a red flag of people who will be undercounted in the census. And it is essentially people cut off their nose to spite their face in this regard, because if you were undercounted in the census, you're then undercounted in the amount of aid given to your county by the federal government to help you fight poverty. So you have a large number of people who are below the poverty line in your county. Those people need the most help from the government, and those are the people least likely to be counted in the census. And that's kind of a problem. Bibb County, here where I am, Macon, same thing, 26.3% is 26.4 in Clark, 26.3 in Bibb County. The reason here, low median income, high proportion living below poverty, and high proportion of black households. Black voters in Georgia tend to not comply with the census. Also, frankly, there are a lot of people who go to work for the census who claim that they've gone into black communities, but because of crime in the area or perception of crime in the area, they don't actually go, and people get undercounted. Macon County, not Macon, Georgia, but Macon County, one of my funny pet peeves with Georgia is how many counties there are that have the same name as cities, and the cities and the counties are never in the same place. Macon County, 26.3% there. Macon County is south of actual Macon. High proportion below the age of 19 with no insurance. High proportion of people above the age of 65 with no insurance. High proportion of people 19 to 65 with no insurance. Now, what does that have to do with it? Statistically speaking, people who have no health insurance are people who live below the poverty line or are migrant populations. And those people, a lot of them may be illegal aliens, and they don't want to talk to a census worker because they're afraid they'll get deported. Down on the coast, Liberty County, 26%, because of a high proportion of renters, high proportion who moved to a different location from last year, and a high proportion of people 18 to 24. That area south of Chatham County has that in Long County as well for the same reason. Also, a high proportion speaking Korean and English not very good, has a lot to do with military bases in that area. And then there's Eccles County, next to Lowndes County, next to Valdosta. 25%, a quarter of the population, is expected to not comply, not answer the census. High proportion of people 19 to 64 with no insurance, and high proportion of American Indian and Alaska Natives in that area, which is an interesting statistic to see. Muskogee County. 27% of Muskogee County, that's Columbus, is expected not to answer the census taker's door knock because of a high proportion of renters and a high proportion of African-American community. Now, renters, in addition to a lot of them being college students who are actually from elsewhere or military in Muskogee County's case, it's hard to get into the apartment complex. Now, according to the law, apartment complexes have to let the census workers in to knock on the doors. But given how apartment complexes are structured, it is often very hard for that to happen. If you are a landlord, though, you're supposed to let them in. Now, Chattahoochee County, which is right next door to Muskogee, same situation really, has a lot to do with age and military. 28.8%. That may be the highest in the state. I think it is the highest in the state. 28.8%. Why? High proportion with children under the age of 6, high proportion of renters, high proportion age 18 to 24. That, again, has a lot to do with military families in the area, among other situations. Those are some of the counties. The other big one is Fulton County. Fulton County is Atlanta. It is Alpharetta. It is there are so many newly incorporated places in Fulton County, I can't keep track of all of them. But has a high proportion of renters and a low rate of prior responses, and so they're worried about it. Atlanta could cause the entire state to be thrown off in the census. Last one you need to know about, actually there are two more you need to know about. Polk County, south of Floyd County, south of Rome. Polk County also is expected to be undercounted in the census. And then Whitfield County on the North Georgia line has a high proportion of Hispanic voters, and that suggests that they will be undercounted. Now, a couple of the counties that are going to expected to do fully well in compliance, Cherokee County, the Woodstock area, is expected to do quite well in answering the census. Pickens County, WYYZ, y'all are expected to answer the census pretty well. Towns and Union County is expected to do pretty good with answering the county. And then Habersham County is at 19%, but still considered really good. The rest of you people need to work on it. Also, Atkinson County down there, you guys in Atkinson County, about a quarter of the population, not expected to answer the census. Now, this may bore you to death, and I'm sorry, but I feel like it's a public service I need to do because there actually are real issues with the ability of people to respond in the state of Georgia to the census. If you do not respond in the state of Georgia, you impact all of us. Richmond County, I just actually, a listener over there said, look at Richmond. Sure enough, Richmond, a quarter of Richmond County, that's Augusta, also expected not to respond because of low median income and high proportion of black households. We know this is going to happen. The state of Georgia is hiring people right now to go into neighborhoods in communities around the state, particularly in these I've mentioned, and encourage people to respond to the census when it happens. This is happening nationwide. Ironically, black voters tend to undermine themselves because they tend to, even more so than legal Hispanic voters, legal Hispanic citizens, I should say. Voters doesn't matter. It's the number of people. So illegals and legals all need to be counted in the census because it all impacts your state's representation and funding. But black voters, black residents tend to be the ones who hurt themselves the most in all of this because even more so than legal Hispanic residents of the country, black residents in the United States tend to do worse than anyone else when it comes to responding to the census. They tend to not respond. They tend to not allow the census worker into their home. They tend to not open the door, and they tend to not return the mail from the census. Now, honestly, I don't blame them. I think it is horribly invasive, but when you get the letter in the mail, frankly, when you get the letter in the mail, respond to the letter in the mail, and you don't have to worry about it. So please, I call out those counties. I don't mean to bore you to death. It is a public service announcement I am doing. By and large, participate in the census next year. It is going to directly affect your state, your county, your city, your school, your census tract, your city block will be affected by the census. That's how important it is to this country. When the founders created this country, they decided to do a manual counting of the population every 10 years in order to figure out how many people lived in this country, in order to figure out congressional districts and districts for houses of representatives, not senates. Typically, you know what used to happen is senates in states would be just like the U.S. Senate. If you have 159 counties, you have 159 senators. Each senator represents a county. Well, you know, Georgia did this, and it's one reason we have so many counties now. They just kept adding new counties. So as Atlanta grew, you'd have more and more state house districts, so you'd have more and more counties, and the population of Atlanta would be offset by rural voters. Eventually, the Supreme Court said, nope, you can't do that anymore. I think there are a couple of states. I think Wisconsin is one that is still allowed to have one senator per county because it didn't have a history of racial discrimination or some such. I think I read that somewhere. Don't hold me to that one. But used to be that way. But still to this day, your state senate, your state house, your county commission lines, your school board districts, your House of Representatives, they're all determined based on how many people live in your area. So you need to respond to the census. You need to tell people in your neighborhood to respond to the census. Everybody needs to participate. Now, I want to take you back. The United States House of Representatives is contemplating impeachment. They are talking. Here is Mike Johnson from Louisiana.
Process deployed against a president like the one that is being used against Donald Trump. They're the ones seeking to nullify our vital constitutional safeguards with this sham. Their ultimate objective is to nullify the votes of the 63 million Americans who voted to elect Donald Trump to president. They violated due process and all the rest. My colleague Sheila Jackson-Lee a little while ago evoked and quoted Barbara Jordan, but she's the one that said during the Watergate inquiry, impeachment not only mandates due process, but due process quadrupled. They have violated that here. They have violated the rules, and everybody in the country can see it. This impeachment's going to fail. The Democrats will pay a heavy political price for it. But the Pandora's box they've opened today will do irreparable injury to our country in the years ahead. That's why we're concerned. That's why the facts matter. And that's why we need to move on. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes?
Chairman.
Ms. Garcia seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm opposed to this amendment. It's incredible to me that the other side of the aisle has not seen the facts and has not apparently read some of the evidence before us. It is obvious to me that this president has put his personal interests above this country. And with that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cicilline.
Rhode Island. Rhode Island.
Sorry?
Rhode Island.
Oh, Rhode Island.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. We've just heard our Republican colleagues claim that there was no demand, no conditionality for the release of this aid. And in fact, it was motivated by this president's deep desire to ferret out corruption. That is laughable. The president of the United States had 2 phone calls with President Zelensky. He never once even uttered the word corruption, because it wasn't about corruption. And the reason we know that is the Department of Defense had already certified that steps had been taken to combat corruption back on May 23rd. And despite that certification, that hold remained in place. In fact, the professionals testified about them trying to figure out, how is it possible it's legal to hold this aid?
That is Cicilline from Rhode Island. He is one of the lead sponsors on the articles of impeachment. The Republicans have moved to strike the first article of impeachment, which is abuse of power. They are debating this. The vote will be held probably this evening, and we will then have the House of Representatives vote next week. And that's about all the rest we need to deal with here on impeachment. When we come back, we do need to begin to delve into Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General, and his report. Even some people on MSNBC are starting to come out and say, you know what, this actually is pretty bad what happened.
Honest news and conservative views.
Never separated from the truth.
It's the Erick Erickson Show.
I want to play you some audio to set the stage for where we need to head. Of all things, it is MSNBC. It is Andre Mitchell on MSNBC. And even she is beginning to note that there are real problems with the Inspector General report. There are real concerns with what happened with the FBI when it came to investigating the Trump campaign and possible collusion with the Russians. Andre Mitchell on MSNBC is not exactly a conservative, a Republican, a Trump supporter. Yet listen.
There were very clear mistakes made by the FBI in the first approval and subsequent reapprovals, submissions for authorization by the FISA court, that special security judge who approves surveillance. And a particular point was something that is pretty egregious, which is the altering of a document to not inform the court and to not inform others that Carter Page, who was a former associate, Trump campaign associate of the president's, was actually also at times a confidential source of the CIA. And to not share that information is which would have been very, obviously exculpatory, which might have led the judge to not approve the surveillance warrant on him. So that is a key thing that, of course, Lindsey Graham, in defense of the president, now the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and the president on the stump are seizing.
The audio cuts out, but you get the point. they did refuse to share information. They did refuse to state facts. Here's Brett Baer on Fox News.
I've watched more hours of hearings over the past 2 weeks than I care to, but one thing that came to the fore again is that a lot of questions were asked again and again and again by both sides, knowing that they had been asked before. Democrats focusing on the determination that there was no political bias in the launching of the investigation. Republicans saying, wait a second, there's no political bias? Can you say that? And Horowitz saying, no, we didn't find any documentary or testimonial evidence, and kind of parsing these words. The bottom line, though, is that there are major, egregious problems in the depth of this IG report. That these 17 things are not just simple mistakes. They are omissions, and in one case, a fraudulent effort to change an email to make a case to a FISA court to wiretap an American citizen. There were confidential sources that were wired up to listen to members of the Trump campaign or people tied to it that were recording them. Democrats said, well, they didn't insert spies into the campaign. No, they were tangential to it, but they were recording people who were tied to it. The Crossfire Hurricane team was picked out by Andrew McCabe, the former deputy of the FBI, all of the members, and they oversaw all of this effort. McCabe is now a contributor at another network. There were administration officials and GOP people who were tweeting out that that network didn't take a lot of this coverage today. But I'll tell you, at the end of this day, both sides of the aisle admitted that there are serious problems in the FISA court system, and ones that they have to address quickly.
There's a real problem for the FBI in this audio, and we're going to hear from the Inspector General when we come back. There's just not enough time right now before we go to break to really dive into his audio and what he said, but it's pretty bad. And it is worth noting that Andrew McCabe had a role to play in this. And Andrew McCabe is now a paid contributor at CNN. In fact, you will hear when we come back that all the people were picked by Andrew McCabe on these teams. And you will hear that the FISA court was lied to by a lawyer for the FBI. The lawyer for the FBI found out from the CIA that Carter Page was actually a source for the CIA. And the lawyer for the FBI changed the documents to say the CIA said he was not a source for the CIA. That lawyer is now going to be charged with a felony from the FBI. He nearly got away with it. The Democrats insist that there was a factual basis outside of the Christopher Steele dossier for pursuing these claims. The Republicans insist that's not so. The Inspector General says there was a factual basis. And now John Durham and Bill Barr are coming out saying, wait a second, we may have some more information to add to this that will change your opinion. And the Democrats are doubling down on partisan talking points on this. I want to get into it when we come back, and we need to listen to this audio. It is deeply, every American, regardless of partisanship, should be troubled by what the FBI did. Hello and welcome across the state of Georgia. I am Erick Erickson. This is the Erick Erickson Show. The phone number, if you would like to call in, 877-97-ERIC. 877-973-7425. You can email me, Erick, it's E-R-I-C-K, at theresurgent.com. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. It's E.W. Erickson at all of them. Erick, E-R-I-C-K. Delta is going to hire 1,300 pilots, 2,500 flight attendants next year, which is incredible. The largest round of hiring in a single year in more than 2 decades. It's hiring pilots for Atlanta, New York, Minneapolis, Detroit, Seattle, and elsewhere. It's part of a broader effort to hire more than 8,000 pilots over the next decade. As pilots are retiring, there is actually a shortage of pilots in the nation right now. It's interesting. Now, I don't want to spend any more time on that. I want to get into the Inspector General's report. I think it is a really big deal. It is getting the press coverage that it is due from Fox, and I'm a little bit disappointed in CNN's handling it. Now, and not everyone at CNN. I should note that. Jake Tapper actually has done a good job of covering this and is being troubled by this. Andrew McCabe, however, is involved in this. He is now a CNN contributor. I want to replay part of Brett Baer's statements yesterday on Fox News as he watched this stuff play out. And then we got a lot of audio that you need to listen to understand what's happening.
Bottom line, though, is that there are major, egregious problems in the depth of this IG report. That these 17 things are not just simple mistakes. They are omissions, and in one case, a fraudulent effort to change an email to make a case to a FISA court to wiretap an American citizen. There were confidential sources that were wired up to listen to members of the Trump campaign or people tied to it that were recording them. Democrats said, well, they didn't insert spies into the campaign. No, they were tangential to it, but they were recording people who were tied to it. The Crossfire Hurricane team was picked out by Andrew McCabe, the former deputy of the FBI, all of the members, and they oversaw all of this effort. McCabe is now a contributor at another network. There were administration officials and GOP people who were tweeting out that that network didn't take a lot of this coverage today. But I'll tell you, at the end of this day, both sides of the aisle admitted that there are serious problems in the FISA court system and ones that they have to address quickly.
Yes, they do, and that is CNN, where Andrew McCabe is hired. In fact, don't believe Brett Baer, don't take his word for it. Here's Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General.
These are experienced people, right?
In this case, these were experienced people.
Many of them had professional degrees, include but not limited to law degrees, right?
I actually don't know what all their degrees were.
Okay. They knew the law.
They should have not only known the law, they should have known every single policy that they had to deal with.
I mean, they were handpicked by Mr. McCabe, right?
They were handpicked.
Okay. This wasn't their first rodeo.
It certainly wasn't, with maybe an exception or two towards the end, of relatively new agents coming on board.
Well,
but that to me, should not have been an excuse, just
sure.
To be clear.
Well, it just seems to me that it has to be one or two things. Either incompetence or intentional conduct.
I agree. It's either sheer incompetence, intentionality, or something perhaps in between.
So which do you think it is?
We've got so many different people here. First of all, it wouldn't be fair to lump everybody into one, because there are different actors coming in at different times. Some people have more touches of this than others. I think it's fair for people to sit there and look at all of these 17 events and wonder how it could be purely incompetence. Okay.
Well, I want to thank you again. I know this puts you in a tough spot. And I hope you'll tell your colleagues back at the FBI that we appreciate their work.
Absolutely.
But this got to be fixed.
Yeah.
At a minimum, somebody's got to be fired.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the person who should be fired was probably Andrew McCabe, who's now got a sweet gig at CNN. That was Senator Kennedy of Louisiana asking the questions. He also Kennedy is always one to coin a great phrase. He's the Doug Collins of the Senate in that regard. Listen to this.
I believe the FBI is the premier law enforcement agency in all of human history. Would you disagree with that?
I would not.
But clearly we've got some bad apples. I want to thank you, and I want to thank your team for your usual superb job. After I haven't read the entire report. I'm about 70% of the way through, but I'm going to finish it. It's tedious.
Yes.
I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. It's supposed to be tedious.
Right.
After about 15% of the way through, it made me want to heave. After about 25% of the way through, I thought I'd dropped acid. It's surreal.
Oh, which raises all sorts of questions, does it not? Now, I do want to play, just in the interest of full disclosure, fairness, and everything else, I do want to play for you some of what Dianne Feinstein had to say. Because Horowitz, one of the things Horowitz contends that the John Durham, who is investigating the situation, feels as well, is wrong. Horowitz says he actually thinks that there was no basis or that there was no political motivation for the investigation. Horowitz thinks that there was a lot of justification for proceeding down the road. I want to explain that to you, but before I do, let me set the stage with the interaction with Dianne Feinstein, the senior senator from California.
The Inspector General kept his promise. His office conducted a 19-month investigation. They interviewed more than 100 witnesses, reviewed more than 1 million documents, and issued this 434-page report that contained several important findings. First, on a question of bias, Inspector General Horowitz found no evidence that political or anti-Trump bias was at play. According to the IG's report, the FBI complied with existing department and FBI policies in opening the investigation. And the IG, quote, did not find documentary or testimonial evidence that political bias or improper motivation influenced this decision, end quote, or any specific investigative steps taken by the FBI. That's the finding. And this is important. Why? In public statements beginning last spring, the Attorney General expressed his belief that senior government officials may have, quote, put a thumb on the scale, end quote, because of political bias against Trump. His comments echoed the president, who has repeatedly alleged that there is a deep state within the government against him. He has used this to dismiss the entire Russia investigation as a witch hunt and a hoax. The IG's report conclusively refutes these claims. This was not a politically motivated investigation. There is no deep state. Simply put, the FBI investigation was motivated by facts, not bias.
She says that, except the New York Times has come out in praise of the deep state recently, and John Durham, the man who is highly respected by the Democrats, who's been put in charge of an investigation by Bill Barr, says, you know what, we may actually, it's not that the Inspector General got it wrong, it's that they may have withheld information from the Inspector General, and he's investigating that. I want to play you from yesterday. We didn't get a chance to get to this yesterday, but it's what Bill Barr had to say about the Durham investigation.
What do you think, what questions will John Durham address that the IG didn't? Well, Durham is looking at the whole waterfront. He is looking at the issue of how it got started. he's looking at whether or not the narrative of Trump being involved in the Russian interference actually preceded July and was in fact the precipitating trigger for the investigation. He's also looking at the conduct of the investigation. There are some things that were done in the investigation that are not included in Horowitz's report, and he's looking at those things. But also, a few weeks ago, I told him that he should spend just as much attention on the post-election period. And I did that because of some of the stuff that Horowitz has uncovered, which to me is inexplicable. Inexplicable. Well, what I said is their case collapsed after the election, and they never told the court, and they kept on getting renewals on these applications. There was documents falsified in order to get these renewals. There was all kinds of withholding of information from the court. And the question really is, what was the agenda after the election that kept them pressing ahead after their case collapsed? This is the President of the United States.
Yeah, he's right. One of the things Durham finds, or one of the things Horowitz found, is that the FBI lied to the FISA court. Like, an FBI lawyer actually changed a document to present it to the FISA court. Here's William Barr on Horowitz himself and his review.
The Inspector General says he found no evidence to indicate that the FBI's decision to start this investigation was based on political bias. Do you agree?
Well, what he actually, I think you have to understand what the IG's methodology is, and I think it's the appropriate methodology for an inspector general. He starts with limited information. He can only talk to people who are essentially there as employees, and he's limited to the information generally in the FBI. But his approach is to say, if I get an explanation from the people I'm investigating that is not unreasonable on its face, then I will accept it as long as there's not contradictory testimonial or documentary evidence. In other words, it's a very deferential standard. And all he said is, people gave me an explanation and I didn't find anything to contradict it, so I don't have a basis for saying that there was improper motive. But he hasn't decided the issue of improper motive.
Have you?
No. I think we have to wait until the investigation, the full investigation is done, and that's the fundamental distinction between what Durham is doing and what the IG is doing. Durham is not limited to the FBI. He can talk to other agencies. He can compel people to testify. One of the problems in the IG's investigation, I think he would agree, is that Comey refused to sign back up for his security clearance and therefore couldn't be questioned about classified matters. So someone like Durham can compel testimony. He can talk to a whole range of people, private parties, foreign governments, and so forth. And I think that is the point at which a decision has to be made about motivations. And I think right now it would be premature to make any judgment one way or the other.
Yes, Horowitz said that he didn't think there was political motivation. He didn't think there was political motivation, but some of the things that actually came out were actually really troubling between how they handled it, how they got it, how they began it, and the information they presented to the courts. We need to hear what they did in court. I mean, one of these guys from the FBI is probably going to go to jail, deservedly so, for what he did. And again, a major news network that has gone wall to wall with impeachment coverage did not want to go to coverage with this yesterday. And it just so happens that they made a big deal about hiring one of the people who is implicated now in the Inspector General's report. And that's problematic.
Want to be on the show? Call Erick now at 877-97-ERIC. That's 877-97.
can call in 877-973-7425, and I will take your phone call. Maybe. Unless you're... when I first started doing radio 9 to midnight, so I got hired when Herman Cain was running for president, and I got hired to take his job when he was running for president, and I started. He stuck around for a couple of months, and so I started, and my show was from 9 to midnight, and it was about the time everybody was talking about the Obama phones, and it was a big deal, and sure enough, they were real, and people would call, and oh my goodness gracious, they were a lot of drunk people calling. I got a lot of drunk people would call, particularly after 10 p.m. You would get really intoxicated people calling radio shows. And, it was very interesting. So don't call me drunk or obnoxious. But if you have a question or your comment on impeachment or the FISA stuff, 877-973-7425. Let us delve in now to some more of the audio on the situation with the FISA, and this from Lindsey Graham.
Surveilling Carter Page became unlawful?
I will let the court decide that. The court has this report and will make that decision.
Let's put it this way. If you don't have a legal foundation to surveil somebody and you keep doing it, is that bad?
Absolutely.
Is that spying?
It's not. It's illegal surveillance. It's not court authorized.
Whatever illegal surveillance means, they did it. So all this stuff that they didn't illegally surveil Trump's campaign, they did because they had no legal basis after the January 2017 data dump by the Russian guy to believe that the dossier was reliable.
It's fair. Now, here's the clip I've been waiting for. This one's short. It's to the point. Richard Blumenthal is the senator from Connecticut. He's the former attorney general of Connecticut. He clearly knows never to ask questions that you don't already know the answer to. But he didn't know the answer to his questions. And this went viral yesterday. And even Democrats were saying, ooh, that's a bad look for Blumenthal. He clearly had not read the inspector general's report that showed that the FBI provided false information to the FISA court.
Those FISA warrants, they were renewed a number of times, correct?
3 times.
Based on your experience and maybe your report, there's a reason why warrants are renewed. They're renewed because they are producing useful information, correct?
Or they should be producing useful information.
They should be.
That's how I'll phrase it.
And your review of those warrants would indicate that they were producing useful information, correct?
Not sure that's entirely correct, and I don't know how much I can say about that in this setting.
Well, they were producing information.
They were producing information. I'm not sure how I would characterize whether they were helpful or not.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
For example, the Crossfire Hurricane team obtained information from Steele's primary subsource in January 2017 that raised significant questions about the reliability of the Steele reporting. This was particularly noteworthy because the FISA applications relied entirely on information from the primary subsource's reporting to support the allegation that Page was coordinating with the Russian government on 2016 U.S. presidential election activities. However, the FBI did not share this information with department lawyers, and it was therefore omitted from the last 2 renewal applications.
Yeah. Way to go, FBI. I mean, again, even Democrats out there are expressing concern about this. I mean, let's just go back to some of the commentary on MSNBC about this.
Any indictment that Robert Mueller brought depends on the Steele dossier, and no aspect of any indictment that Robert Mueller brought depends on the surveillance of Carter Page. And so, I don't want to diminish the IG's findings or be dismissive of the IG's findings on the FISA material, because frankly, they're very upsetting, and this is not the way the process should work.
It is not the way the process should work. A little bit more about the process. I got a clip I want to play for you, but it's over 2 minutes long. It is just the Inspector General. It's about 2 minutes, 17 seconds. We got about less than 30 seconds here. When we come back, you need to hear this. It is the ultimate summation of what went wrong, and then we'll let some of the Republicans grandstand a little bit. I got some good audio from some of the Republicans outraged by it, but you got to hear what the Inspector General says about his own report in his own words when we come back here on the Erick Erickson Show across the state of Georgia. The phone number, 877-97-ERIC. Hi there. It is Erick Erickson, and you need to know something. Real Clear Politics does polling averages. Polling averages are always better than individual polls. The reason polling averages are always better than individual polls is because some polls suck and some polls are really good. And you put the average together and you get a fairly good snapshot of where things are. And, well, you need to know something significant has happened. For the first time since they began asking, October 1st, since they began doing a poll of public support for impeachment, the polling average has always had public support for impeachment higher than public opposition to impeachment. For the first time ever, support and opposition to impeachment are tied. And it's very interesting to see the polling. Monmouth University has a no at 7 points. Quinnipiac has no up 6 points. Politico has yes up 9 points. Economist has yes up 4 points. It's interesting to see that there isn't a ton of it out there, but it is. I mean, Quinnipiac has had, let's see, NPR has it tied. Gallup has no by 2. Quinnipiac in the end of November had no up 3. Now it has no up 6. This is interesting. It's interesting to know about. This comes on the heels of the Inspector General report that shows the FBI really screwed things up. I want to play for you now the audio of Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General of the Justice Department, explaining just how badly things were screwed up. He is interacting with members of the Senate, of course. You'll hear them, but listen to him.
Surveillance authority under FISA can significantly assist the government's efforts to combat terrorism, clandestine intelligence activity, and other threats to the national security. At the same time, the use of this authority unavoidably raises civil liberties concerns. FISA orders can be used to surveil U.S. persons, and in some cases, the surveillance will foreseeably collect information about the individual's constitutionally protected activities, such as Carter Page's legitimate activities on behalf of a presidential campaign. Moreover, proceedings before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is responsible for ruling on applications for FISA orders, are ex parte, meaning that unlike most court proceedings, the government is the only party present for the proceedings, and FISA orders have not been subject to scrutiny through subsequent adversarial proceedings like court-authorized search warrants and wiretap applications are potentially through the criminal process. In light of these concerns, the FISA statute and Department and FBI policies and procedures have established important safeguards to protect the FISA application process from irregularities and abuse. Among the most important are the requirements in FBI policy that every FISA application must contain a, quote, full and accurate, close quote, presentation of the facts, and that agents must ensure that all factual statements in FISA applications are, quote, scrupulously accurate, close quote. These are the standards for all FISA applications, regardless of the investigation's sensitivity, and it is incumbent upon the FBI to meet them in every application. Nevertheless, we found that investigators failed to meet their basic obligations of ensuring that the FISA applications were scrupulously accurate. We identified significant inaccuracies and omissions in each of the 4 applications, 7 in the first application, and a total of 17 by the final renewal application.
17. Here's Josh Hawley, Senator from Missouri.
Is it worse to have a foreign government trying to meddle in our elections? Or is it worse to have our own government meddling in the election? Because that's, I think, exactly what this report shows. It shows that our government, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the nation, the FBI, effectively meddled in an ongoing presidential campaign. And the thing that gets me is you expect it from foreign governments. I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying that you expect it. They've been doing it for years. Russia's been doing it for years. We know they tried to do it this last cycle. China has been doing it. Others have been doing it. And we know what steps to take We've got to take them more effectively. But when our own government does it, how can the American people have confidence? And what do we do? I mean, what do we do? And there's one actor here, I think, who has not gotten the credit that they collectively deserve, and that's the Democrat National Committee. I just think, I've heard my friends on the other side of the aisle complain about Hillary Clinton's campaign and how ineffective it was and how the DNC didn't do a good job in 2016. I beg to differ. This is the most incredible. The DNC pays for the Steele dossier, solicits the Steele dossier, and then gets the Federal Bureau of Investigation to go get FISA warrants, surveil an American citizen, surveil a presidential campaign, all on the basis of this manufactured garbage that they paid for. I mean, that's extraordinary. That has got to be a first time in history.
And here's Ted Cruz. Listen to this one. This one has pretty much gone viral.
And I can tell you from my time at the Department of Justice and from my time in law enforcement, any responsible leader, when hearing that you're talking about sending in spies and sending in a wiretap on any presidential nominee, should say, what in the hell are we doing? And by the way, the people up the chain who are saying we didn't know, if you had responsible leadership, there's no more important decision than you make. I can tell you when I was at DOJ, if someone said, let's tap Hillary Clinton, or let's tap Bill Clinton or John Kerry, the people there would have said, what in the hell are you talking about? What was going on here? This wasn't Jason Bourne. This was Beavis and Butthead.
Beavis and Butthead. And, the other thing, Ted Cruz really putting a succinct nutshell on is the fact that they actually did change written statements before the FISA court. I mean, just consider that for a moment, that they changed written statements from the CIA to the FISA court. Listen to this exchange with Cruz and Horowitz. Well, let me rearrange the audio here so you can hear it. Yeah, sorry, folks. Technical difficulties all of a sudden here with the computer system. It's one of those gremlin days. Here we go. Let's see if this fixes it.
So the men and women at home need to know what's happening. A lawyer at the FBI creates fraudulent evidence, alters an email. That is in turn used as the basis for a sworn statement to the court that the court relies on. Am I stating that accurately?
That's correct. That is what occurred.
Wow. They altered, and just so you understand here, the lawyer for the FBI reached out to the CIA and said, hey, is this guy a CIA informant, Carter Page? And the lawyer for the FBI said, yes, this guy is a CIA informant. I'm sorry, the CIA tells the FBI, yes, this guy is a lawyer source for the CIA. And what happens? The lawyer, Kleinsmith is his name, alters the document. So that the judge is told that Carter Page is not a source for the CIA.
When you read this report, what they find is that a lawyer supervising the FISA process at the FBI, according to Mr. Horowitz, doctored an email from the CIA to the FBI, and he's going to be referred for criminal prosecution. Why is that important? Carter Page, who's been on the receiving end of all this, the foundation to believe he was a foreign agent comes from a dossier that we'll talk about in a minute. In that dossier provided by Christopher Steele, and we'll talk about him in a minute, they claim that Carter Page meets with 3 people known to be Russians, Russian agents, people associated with Russia. Carter Page, while being wiretapped by his government, says, I don't know 2 of these people, and to this day, there is no proof that he ever met 2 of those 3. The 3rd person, he says, yeah, I met him. I told the CIA about my meeting because I was a source for the CIA. So they would have you believe that Carter Page is working against our government, not with our government. So Carter Page in the summer of 2017 is trying to tell anybody and everybody, I was working with the CIA, I reported my contact with this person, and nobody believed him. The CIA had told the FBI it was true earlier, but it never made it through the system. Somebody got so rattled at the FBI, they asked Mr. Kleinsmith to check it out. He checks it out. He communicates with the CIA. Is Carter Page a source for you? In an email exchange, they say, yes, he is. What does Mr. Kleinsmith do? He alters the email to say, no, he's not. And you caught him. When you read.
Wow. That actually happened, y'all. That actually happened. Kleinsmith at the FBI, who is overseeing the FISA process, actually did that. And he's probably going to go to jail now for a felony. Here's Mike Lee, senator from Utah.
So we're faced with two possibilities. Either one, these FBI agents purposely used the power of the federal government to wage a political war against a presidential candidate they despised, or two, these agents were so incompetent that they allowed a paid foreign political operative to weaponize the FISA program into a spying operation on a rival presidential political campaign. I'm not sure about you, but I'm not sure which one is worse. I am sure that neither conclusion is acceptable. They're both horrifying for slightly different reasons. I'm not sure there is a substantive distinction between the two of them. I'm not sure one can conclude. I'm not sure it's possible to conclude that the bias evident in communications between some of these investigators wasn't at least a part of it. Now, the fact that you say that there wasn't a causal connection between them, that there wasn't a sine qua non with but-for causal chain between those communications and the opening of the investigation itself is beside the point. The fact is, these were agents who made their bias clear, and they went after someone in part because they did not like his candidacy.
And in fact, here's what the IG says about the briefings that the Trump campaign was being given by the FBI.
I've been asking questions since September 2017.
This is Charles
about
Grassley
what
speaking
kind
first.
of defensive briefings the FBI provided to the Trump campaign. The FBI told me its briefings to both campaigns were similar and that it wasn't aware of action that it took as a result. Chairman Johnson and I wrote again to the FBI 2 months ago. We noted that text messages between Strzok and Page indicated that the FBI may have used defensive briefings not to warn the Trump campaign, but to investigate it. 4 questions along this line. Question number 1, would you agree that with respect to the defensive briefings, the Trump campaign's briefings were treated differently than those provided to the Clinton campaign?
If I could, they were called strategic. It was not an FBI briefing. The FBI went to a Office of the National Director of National Intelligence briefing. It was a strategic counterintelligence briefing, and I mention that because it precisely wasn't a defensive briefing. It was an intelligence briefing, and they were treated differently in that the agent wrote it up to the file and put the information in the file. The briefings were identical, but the net result was one was for investigative purposes and one was purely for the intelligence briefing.
Mm-hmm. And here's more Lindsey Graham.
Thank you very much. And again, to your team, thank you for the service you've done to the country here. The former FBI Director James Comey said this week that your report vindicates him. Is that a fair assessment of your report?
I think the activities we found here don't vindicate anybody who touched this.
Okay. Let's run a clip here. This is what Comey said in 2018. It would be nice to have sound. Do we have sound? Okay.
Never mind, I'll read it. Director Comey, the reporter, is asking him, can I ask you a question on FISA abuse? It's a major issue for the Republicans. Do you have a total confidence in the dossier when you used it to secure a surveillance warrant and also in the subsequent renewals? This was asked in December of 2018, about a year ago. Comey, I have total confidence that the FISA process was followed, that the entire case was handled in a thoughtful, responsible way by DOJ and the FBI. I think the notion that FISA was abused here is nonsense. Would it be fair to say that you take issue with that statement?
Certainly our findings were that there were significant problems.
So when Comey speaks about FISA, you shouldn't listen. You should listen to Mr. Horowitz. He's not vindicated, and to be concerned about the FISA warrant process is not nonsense.
Man, the way Democrats are trying their best to even avoid discussing what Horowitz had to say yesterday tells you everything you need to know about how bad it was for what happened during the Obama administration. Remember the scandal-free administration where nothing bad ever happened?
National connections, local focus. Erick Erickson is live every weekday.
It is Erick Erickson. I haven't sent out the sugar cookie recipe. I will be sending it out shortly. If you want it, there's still time. Text recipe to 33777. If you're already on the list, you don't have to. If you've never texted recipe to 33777, you got time before the sugar cookie recipe goes out. There is an election today in the United Kingdom, and the polling has been interesting in that the Tories there, the Conservative Party, had a really big lead, and that lead has kind of gone down as the Labour Party has surged, but they're still expected to win. The Conservatives are. We just don't know how big their margin is going to be. There is a suggestion of a hung parliament, which could be interesting. Brexit is the big issue there. I got to tell you, I'm a little bit envious of the campaign coming to an end in the UK today. In Britain, a parliament can stay in and for 5 years and then has to have an election, or they can call an election early. They changed the law a few years ago where it used to be the prime minister could just call the election when his party was as high as they were in the polls, and it got changed where it happens every 5 years, and then you need a vote, 2/3 vote to call one sooner than that. It'd be interesting to see if Boris Johnson were to scrap that and their Supreme Court, which a lot of newspapers across the board in Britain are complaining. They decided to get a Supreme Court in Great Britain. It was one of the Tony Blair reforms back in the day. And the Supreme Court in Britain is increasingly involved in political decisions, and there's a lot of hostility to it across the board. Even the BBC, is taking on a lot of heat there. Now, I'm getting to the point here. You'll have to forgive me. I'm fascinated by Britain and British elections. I spent a lot of time there growing up as a kid. But we've got PBS in this country. I tell people all the time so what you're listening to right now is the most listened to news talk program across the state of Georgia on commercial radio. People say, well there are programs on GPB. Well, GPB is a state-funded entity. On commercial radio, I'm your guy in Georgia, across the state. And there's no other program like this across the state, and we're still trying to get further across the state. We're still trying to get into some markets. But PBS gets taxpayer dollars. I don't. I do this all on my own. Your local station that you're listening to sells advertising and uses that advertising to fund the station. We compete against a publicly subsidized program and publicly subsidized radio station that doesn't have to run ads because it can shake you down via the government. In Britain, though, there's an automatic shakedown. If you buy a television in Great Britain, you are forced to pay a license fee to the BBC. If you buy a TV in Great Britain, the BBC gets money from the sale automatically. And now the Conservatives are threatening to get rid of that. It'll be interesting to see if they have a PBS-style fight there. Will they get accused of killing Big Bird?